Cloud. I'm Zoe Buckingham, AP's Head of Marketing, and I'm here with Simon Hudson, founder of Cloud2, a company responsible for creating the most sophisticated SharePoint intranet in the world. I'm also joined by Mick McGuinness, one of our directors and a leading SharePoint performance specialist. On your screen, you will see a control panel. This control panel contains a questions box where you can type questions to be answered by the speakers. Simon and Mick will be pleased to answer your questions at the end of the presentation. So thank you for joining us, and over to Simon.
Thanks, Zoe. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to move on to the first slide, hopefully, and we'll start getting this thing underway. I'm going to give you a bit of a chat around some things that we've learned by building intranets and other solutions in the cloud, and particularly on Office 365. It's going to take about 30 minutes, and then I'm going to hand over to Mick, and as we said, we'll try and take questions at the end, but if you have any that you want to raise during the session, please enter them in the chat window. The slides will be available after the session, so you don't need to take massive amounts of notes. And I just want to reassure everybody that I'm not really here to do a selling job at all. I just want to talk about some of the interesting advantages and challenges of doing interesting things in the cloud. So move on to the next slide. I guess the question to start with is, why would we even want to do that? What's wrong with doing things the old way? And the answer, I think, is that we don't really live in the old world anymore. The world of today has changed enormously from the old method of go to the office, use some applications, do some email, maybe make some calls, talk to some people, use some applications again, maybe attend a few meetings, hopefully make some money, and then probably at the end of it, go home. That isn't the world anymore, and if you are a person still doing it in that old way, probably that role or those days are numbered. One of the big issues, one of the big changes is around mobility. Again, in the old world, doing mobile working was hard. If you had to be away from the office, away from your desk, you could lump your laptop around with you, but in order to get all of your stuff, your content, your applications, your colleagues, that proved to be rather difficult. You needed all sorts of technology such as secure tokens, Citrix dial-in, those kinds of things, and the user experience was poor with an increasing number of passwords and quite a lot of complexity. The experience was often quite poor, quite slow, and for the organizations trying to enable it, it wasn't particularly inexpensive. Today, however, whether you're on a train, as I seem to be so often, at a cafe, at a bus stop, in the living room, at a client site, actually those are your new workplace and you should be enabled to work efficiently. So another consideration is that the experience that we have at home and in the workplace is now very different. Once upon a time, you had your technology provided by your company, and the stuff you had at home, unless you're a geek like me, probably lagged that. Today, it's more or less the reverse. Even the least geeky of us tends to have better technology in the home or the living room than you do in the workplace. So how do you address that as an organization? I mean, one of the problems is that people, because technology has become consumerized, they have such a good experience with the technologies they have at home, they don't really appreciate that the corporate world is different. And the things that companies need to do around supportability, reliability, cost effectiveness, security, compliance, governance, all those important things are often not appreciated by staff at all. They just want their stuff to work. Equally, they want to be able to have skills to use the new tools, but they seem to be fine with learning those skills themselves at home, but absolutely not fine when the organization comes along and says you need to learn this new application or this new piece of tech. I think we need to think about some ways to address that. In our view, some of the cloud technologies help that. So let's look at some of the benefits of moving into the cloud. So some of the things that we see is cloud technologies enable the following. You can work pretty much anywhere and on more or less any modern device. Ironically, or perhaps unexpectedly, the risk of data loss or leakage is actually lower in the cloud. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about security in the cloud in a future slide. But what we've seen is that where there are blockages to people being able to do their job, they'll work around it. They'll stick a USB stick in their pocket, or they'll copy things onto a local hard drive, and thereby create a data breach. Being able to provide access to what you need when you need it in a secure and managed way is a real way to reduce risk of data loss. Other key things, and perhaps one of the reasons that the cloud technologies started in the first place, was around flexibility. The ability to buy things when you need them, to scale that buying up and down, to be able to get it now instead of waiting weeks or months to get hardware in, changing that whole model of how we get the services we need. Support is lower as well. We see significant amounts of support staff in organisations, and you can take out a lot of those people, or better still redeploy them to more value-adding activities by letting your cloud provider take care of all the infrastructure and application level management. For us, a big opportunity, and unfortunately one that isn't always immediately grasped by clients, is the ability to enable new ways of working, better ways of working. And we'll talk about those a little as I go along. I think there's an interesting question around how do you future-proof, and cloud technologies certainly tend to do that, although there's a cost or a change in thinking around future-proofing. And again, I'm going to touch on that. And if we do all this right, we should see better staff productivity. The applications, the services, the infrastructure, the interconnectedness and integration of the stuff that we're using should be better. And if that doesn't produce better staff productivity, then maybe we've missed a trick. So before we get into all the detail, I want to just flag up some risks or some watch-outs and considerations of moving into the cloud. And one of the first of those, probably the first that I'm always confronted with when I'm talking to clients, particularly outside of the IT community, is it safe? So let's think about, is it safe for a moment? We think that over the last sort of 5 or 8 years where cloud technologies have been becoming available, is that they have matured. And in the reality, most organizations today have got these networks and physical applications that is at best no better than what we can do in the cloud. And we were quite a close Microsoft cloud partner, so maybe I'm biased, but Microsoft are widely considered to be amongst the most secure. I'm going to talk a bit more as we go along around why that's secure, but I want to highlight right at the outset that one of the biggest single threats to any security system is not the technology, not where it's located, but it is what staff do. So moving to the cloud doesn't change that, but you still need to make sure that your staff are educated through policy and training to understand the importance of their actions on the security of your content and business and processes. So, there are a few reasons even to reject cloud solutions out of hand. What we see is a significant number of financial institutions who are amongst the most paranoid in the world have moved to the cloud already. We're dealing with a number of banks that already have substantial amounts of applications running in the cloud. Most of the issues around commercially sensitive and legally sensitive issues are addressed, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Data Protection Act in a moment. The things that stop us are really lack of understanding, paranoia, and perhaps in a few cases internal or externally applied policy, and perhaps we can't do much about those. There are safeguards available, so if your paranoia gland is suitably enlarged, and that's entirely appropriate in some cases, there are additional tools that you can plug in to improve monitoring and governance. What we do advise, though, is that any organisation does their due diligence and research to make sure they understand what the risks and opportunities are. It isn't just coming from a vendor, even if that vendor is credible, like we like to think that we are. Right, so let's have a look at that in a bit more detail. You know, it's interesting, my PowerPoint presentation seems to have actually hung on that slide. I might just have to restart the slide. Give me one moment. With a little bit of luck, that'll bring it back up. Okay, so let's just start with some of those security myths. There's common things said about the cloud. People say, well, it's not very secure. I wouldn't trust my data to the cloud. Let's just put some data behind my attempt to deflect that myth or undermine it. The reality is that most cloud-based physical data centers are very, very secure indeed, far more secure than most of our clients' on-premise implementations. Because they operate at scale, they can afford to implement multiple layers of physical security. They can have very sophisticated security systems in place, such as biometric readers, motion sensors, all the other things you see on my slide here. Most of these services have high levels of encryption. I was talking with some folk yesterday that were saying, oh, is Skype secure? And I mentioned that actually it uses 256-bit AES encryption, actually higher than the requirement that they use internally. And I'm not saying we should use Skype, but I'm just saying that even things which are considered to be sort of public tools are more secure than some of the corporate tools that people use internally. We can address things like the Data Protection Act. Most of the cloud providers have already got really good processes for keeping cloud data within Europe. Although, again, I'm going to just mention Microsoft at this point. Microsoft have 4 major data centers, one in Dublin, one in Amsterdam, one in Singapore, and one in the US. Earlier this year, the EU put out some model clauses and declared that all of the Microsoft data centers, including those in the US and the US and Singapore, are considered to be within Europe as far as the Data Protection Act is concerned, such as the quality of data protection and governance that they put around that. You can also quite easily turn on additional security in the form of multi-factor authentication. So just a quick slide here. This is a comment on the Microsoft infrastructure. Even the Microsoft people don't have access to most of this infrastructure. It's all accessed remotely. Those remote accesses are monitored and governed, but physically you can't even get into the data centers in most cases. The people that can are carefully tracked. Right, I'm going to move on. So some other risks we ought to think about, and this is an important one for me, one that I try and get my clients to understand, is that with a cloud service, you don't own the application. You've delegated that to your provider, and they are inclined to do cunning things like improve it when you're not looking. Now, in many ways, that's a really good thing, but you need to understand that cloud services are dynamically changing. They will change without your permission. You will get some notice about that, but you need to act on that. And you may or may not have any control or limited control in how long you can delay before new features are rolled out to you. So you need to change your mindset, and that's something which takes a little bit of thinking. You haven't got control over the process, and there are some things around your business and the way your business may change that may not be completely consistent with the cloud. I'm going to talk a little bit more in a minute about what happens if you change your organization name. So there is a cultural change that needs to be accommodated, where instead of being behind the curve, you're now ahead of the curve, or at least right on the cusp of the curve, but you need to explain to your users and possibly to your management team that that's going to happen regardless of whether you want it or not. So that's something to consider. Let me just think about also what the culture piece looks like. This is the old way of work. Some of us are almost old enough to remember this. The old way of work was you had a person, they sat at probably a typewriter, they had a phone for making calls, and they had some kind of inbox. And if we fast forward, sort of 50 years, this is what it looks like today, where you've got a person sitting at a desk typing stuff into a thing that's an analog of a typewriter, and they have a telephone, and probably they've got an inbox, which may or may not be paper, but they've definitely got an inbox. So the reality is that organizations haven't really changed their working practices much, even though the technology has come along to change things. And I think that there is a need to think a lot about culture and the tendency not to change, and the opportunity to change that the latest technologies, whether in the cloud or otherwise, brings. I'm going to touch on some more pitfalls. So I'm going to talk even more detail in a minute about moving tenancies. A tenancy is the thing that you buy in the cloud. So if I go and sign up with an Amazon service or a Microsoft Office 365 service or even a Google Gmail service, what you're buying is the rights to use one of their tenants. And so you buy a tenancy. And moving those can be difficult. You need to think about account management, and especially you need to think about joiners and leavers. Leavers are particularly problematic because when somebody leaves the organization, there are no physical barriers to them still getting at your stuff, so you need to make sure that there's an active process for removing them from your access groups. You may need to think about synchronization between different systems. That's important. You need to account for the fact that single sign-on isn't inherent across different systems from different providers, so that needs addressing. We've talked about loss of control. Often you'll still need to add in some third-party tools because not all of these cloud solutions are perfect. You are definitely too dependent on the speed of your broadband or fiber connection, and you need to address that. And you need to think about perceived performance. Often people go, now we're in the cloud, things are slower. Actually, our observation is that the tools themselves are better, you can do things more swiftly, but if you just look at the raw speed of opening a file from a cloud service compared with opening it from your hard drive, it's going to be slower, and you need to do some things to address the perception from users that there is a gap there. So let me just touch on that deep thing. This is one of the big gotchas that we've encountered. What happens if you change your name? As an organisation, you come along and today you're called cloud2.co.uk, that's our name, or maybe you're Big Pharma Limited, and you've now joined with Rather Large Pharma Inc. and you want to change your name to Jolly Large Pharma PLC. There's a problem with that on the Microsoft platform, which is you cannot easily change the vanity name, the cloud2.co.uk. You can change your DNS lookups, so I'm getting into some technology here, so you can go and change the thing which people type in initially, but the name which Microsoft and some of the other platforms show in the browser once you've logged in will have a particular name, like cloud2.co.uk, which I've shown on the screen there. And if you want to go and change that to something different, let's say we want to become Cloud3 and I need to change that, well, it's not easy. And I'm going to do a very simple pie chart here, which will explain how easy it is. This is a pie of all the things that are easy, and this is tenant migration. The reality today with lots of these services, and especially with doing some of the Microsoft services, is if you change your name and need that reflecting in your tenant name, you probably have to spin up an entire new SharePoint or Microsoft tenant and move all of your users and content and everything else between the two. So you just need to think about that. Some things are hard in the cloud, some things are brilliantly easy, but there are events that will come along that will bite you, and you need to anticipate that there's some pain around that. So, having given you some bad news, let me give you some good news, some best practice and some thinking there to steer you away from problems. Most of this is going to be related to Office 365 because that's where we spend most of our time, but some of the thoughts apply to other cloud-based solutions as well. So I've mentioned tenant names, and I have mentioned that you've got to get your usernames right up front. You need to think about your account management because it isn't account management just locally. You need to think about your storage and planning. Actually, you kind of have to think about storage even on site, but the storage you get in the cloud is slightly different. You might be able to turn it on more quickly, but you pay per gigabyte usually. You do need to plan for your information architecture because changing that after the event can be quite difficult. And you also need to recognize that with some of these services, they're fairly young, and they're usually built by excellent technical people. And again, I point at Microsoft in this case, fantastic technology, but some of the commercial processes, such as the really easy thing of wanting to change your name, aren't so hot. And some of those commercial processes can make it difficult to change things later on. So you need to plan in advance for those. There are some things you really need to do up front, which I've listed on the right-hand side of this slide. Make sure you plan for those and you don't just sort of skip lightly across them thinking that everything will be fine later on. I've mentioned vanity names. I'm just going to touch on that briefly again. So if I was to create a new Microsoft tenant called tenant on Microsoft.com, and then I decided that was a silly name and I really should have named it after my organization, I can change it after a bit of pain to Cloud2, but all sorts of assets within SharePoint Online, for instance, will retain the first name you get. So you need to think about it before you just jump in. One of the things we don't recommend people do is create a proof of concept and then convert that proof of concept into a live system, because the chances are you haven't thought through all of those little details. So be ready to do a proof of concept and then abandon it and rebuild it. Some other things. I'm going to go through this quite quickly because there's quite a few of these. You need to make sure that you've got your email addresses set up before you start turning on online alerts. Otherwise, they won't work. And you go, I didn't know that the system's gone down, or I didn't know this has changed, because you haven't actually put in place appropriate email addresses within the system. You need to think about your user logon. You've got three options. You can go and let people log on directly to the live cloud systems. That's absolutely fine, but every time somebody does something, they'll be prompted for an alert, for a login, and the login probably isn't the same as they're using in their local systems. You know, when they log into their machine or log into Windows, that their login details are different. So how do you address that? Well, you can synchronize them. There's a tool called Desync that Microsoft have that will synchronize your local domain login with the username and password that you use in the cloud. That's great, It is great. We like that a lot actually, but you still need to log in when you hit your cloud services. So the top of the pile, you know, the royal solution is to use a thing called Active Directory Federation Services. That automatically logs you into all of your cloud services when you've logged into your local machine. But there's a cost and some technology associated with that. So you need to think about where on that scale you need to be and how important is it that you have single sign-on from your local machine directly and automatically into your cloud services. Thinking again about SharePoint Online, let's look at Search Center. SharePoint Online has got a fantastic search. Some organizations, if they're doing a SharePoint solution on-premise, would build their own search solution. We advise against that. We think that the Search Center within SharePoint Online is very good. You should use it. It keeps being improved. Use that rather than building your own. But bear in mind that it's a separate site collection. You won't inherit branding. You'll have to add any branding you want yourself. And one of the problems of site collections within SharePoint Online is you can't easily navigate back to the home. You need to put your own links back to the top-level sites in. There's a really nice capability in SharePoint called Content Query that can pull information from right across the site. So if I want to see all of the news items, for instance, or every document that I've written right across an entire solution, I might use Content Query. But you shouldn't use that on SharePoint Online. Microsoft don't like it. It really, really hurts their infrastructure, and they issue throttling notices. The much better way to do it is using a thing called Content by Search. It's really good, but it takes a bit more effort. You can still use XSLT, so if you want to do dynamic styling and transformation of sites, you can do that, but bear in mind that if you're using things that are using Ajax, you can't enable audiences. Again, I'm talking about some very specific SharePoint features there, but those of you who have tried to use audiences or tried to use Ajax will be aware that you can't use those easily in Content by Search, unless you write some JavaScript. Here's another gotcha. We like using publishing features in SharePoint. But if you do turn on a template with publishing features, or you create a template with publishing features turned on, you can't save those back into the template library. They are useful. There are some workarounds, but you need to think about those. Test and development is something we get asked about a lot. People go, we've got our production environment on SharePoint Online. I just want to spin up a development environment to make sure I can test things and develop things before I go live. And the bottom line is you can't. You don't really have the whole concept of a test and development environment because you don't have a separate infrastructure. That wasn't the key I meant to press. There we go. You could go and create an entire additional tenant, but if you do that, to do test and development, you can't easily migrate or deploy things from your test environment to your live environment. What we see most of the time is that people will create a separate site collection for dev, a separate site collection for test within their live environment. And people are worried about that. Actually, there are relatively few risks associated with doing that. There's no custom code that you can write within the SharePoint Online or most of these other online environments. Therefore, you can't easily break the environment. So the risks of having a dev environment which is actually underneath your live environment isn't such a big problem. And one thing you need to think about is you do need to exclude those test and development environments from your search so you don't accidentally pull back results that are not supposed to be there. There's some thought to be given to very large libraries. Microsoft have upped the limit on site collections. You can have 1 terabyte site collections, which is quite a lot. But if you do the maths, if I have libraries with, say, 5 gigabytes of documents and other content, and I have 200 of those, I just ran up against the site collection limit. So we think if you're running with libraries of content that are reasonably big, in the sort of 10 to 100 gigabyte range, you probably need to think about deploying those in advance to their own site collection and then do some things to pull those into the other sites that you need, just so you don't find yourself accidentally banging up against that 1 terabyte limit. As a site admin, you do need to do some thinking. On-premise, it's very easy to create user profiles and manage those within Active Directory. If you're online, you can't do that. There are some synchronization tools, but mostly you need to manage your users and their user profiles through the site admin panel or put in the synchronization piece I mentioned earlier. We do recommend using some third-party tools to help with all sorts of administration of cloud solutions, and we like the ones from AvePoint and Metalogics, but that isn't a particular recommendation. Those are just the ones that we're using regularly. There is an option in Office 365 to turn on what they call fast adoption. The Office 365 platform has new features coming out all the time, and you have a choice of whether you want to see those and have those deployed to your tenant quickly or slowly. We turn on quickly because we want to see them and get familiarity with them before our clients do, but you may be an organization that wants to have them delivered later, and that gives you, a month's notice in most cases before a new feature comes out. Some of those features will just arrive otherwise, and some of those features may take away things that you want to do. So you need to have visibility of that and either be quick to adopt or slow to adopt. This is one of those rare occasions when it might be useful to have an additional tenant, where you have a tenant which is used for familiarization with fast adoption, which a few people in your organization monitor, and then most of your tenancy is running on a slow adoption route. There's a really cool set of capabilities in SharePoint Online called or SharePoint Online and on-premise, which is around term stores and managing taxonomies. It's not that easy to move things within SharePoint Online term store, so you need to plan your term stores a little more carefully than you would on-premise. A lot of my clients are worried about Infopath. Infopath is a fantastic tool for creating very, very powerful electronic forms, and earlier this year Microsoft announced that they're deprecating Infopath. And our advice to our clients is don't panic. Infopath is still there. It's fully supported in the current version of SharePoint. It's fully supported in the next version of SharePoint, although they will deprecate some features. It still means that they're there, they're just not actively supported, and we know that Infopath will continue to be supported and still portable until past 2020. In the meantime, simple forms, you can use list forms quite effectively, and we can talk about those again if we ever need to. So let's talk about intranets in the cloud. How am I doing on time? I'm getting close to my limit, so I'm going to skip through this. Intranets in the cloud. This is a list of the common sorts of things that we see people using intranets for. I think one of the issues that we have is that intranets are badly defined. No one really knows what an intranet is. So you can kind of define an intranet in terms of the things that people use it for, or you can try and define it in terms of the things that it seeks to address. Which business problems and business needs did an intranet address? And to be honest, I don't really care about the definition, or I'm going to give you one in a moment. What I do care about is what makes a good intranet. And the best intranets are those which are considered to be a broad business solution and a platform, and definitely not the pet project of a particular department. I'm going to say that again because it's so important. The best intranets are those which are about the business and not about a department or a particular evangelist. So, what is an intranet? And is an intranet just SharePoint? This is our thinking. We see some different ideas around intranets. We see people talking about things that they call collaboration intranets, enterprise social networks, things that are primarily about documents and content, things that solve particular business problems, and my particular bête noire, things that are websites for staff, which I'm going to kindly call comms intranets. All of those are valid. There's nothing wrong with any of those. But really, a great intranet should incorporate more than one of those. And we think that if you're doing all 5 of them, you've probably got an enterprise intranet. And so we have this idea of the 5 pillars of an enterprise intranet, and 5 pillars address 5 different business needs around communication, collaboration, content, colleagues, and business processes. And is it about SharePoint? 2 years ago, yes, probably. But today we think it's a stack of technologies. SharePoint still might be at the top, but modern intranets are using SharePoint. If you're in the Microsoft world, they're using SharePoint and OneDrive and Microsoft Office, and perhaps bits of Exchange and Exchange Server and Lync and Yammer. We think it's really important to keep your technologies aligned. So if you're using SharePoint 2013 or SharePoint Online with Office 2000, frankly, you're crazy. And you need to move your technologies up so that they're pretty close to being the same versions. There's also more things coming into that stack. So announcements from Microsoft, Sway, I haven't even had a chance to play with that yet, but it looks like it's a new kind of way of presenting information rather than these rather dull PowerPoint slides that I'm using now. Video Portal, which was actually announced earlier this week as being live. I'm about to play with it myself later this week. Delve, which is a new kind of search and collaboration visibility tool. I'm already playing with that, looks very exciting. And new features which are just being dropped into SharePoint and Office 365 on a sort of weekly basis. So last week at SharePoint Saturday, we learned a bit more about a new tool for helping us with our email, which is a product called Clutter, which aims to remove some of the crud that just accumulates in our inboxes. We're seeing better and deeper integration of Yammer with SharePoint and other tools. We've seen Link go from being Link to Skype for Business, and hopefully some better integration comes along with that. In my heady fly through, here's some best practice things that we think you should do if you're building an intranet in the cloud. And the first thing is, if you've got an intranet in the cloud, stop sending people documents. Don't make documents an attachment. You should definitely send a link to the natural living place of your documents, which is in that intranet in the cloud. And there's all sorts of great benefits of that. You know, you get rid of all these multiple versions. You make sure that as one person changes it, the next person sees that change. You haven't got poor people having to compile all the different changes of documents on the fly. You've got a single version of the truth. It's very powerful. Our recommendation today is stop using check-in, check-out for most users. If you've got your content stored in an intranet in the cloud, you can actually do simultaneous multi-author editing. It's hugely powerful. So things like this presentation, we'd have 2 or 3 of us working on tweaking the slides, and we wouldn't have our own version of it. We'd have one copy of the document, one version of the PowerPoint, one version of the Word, and we were multiple people editing at the same time. We would use version control. We might use version approval or publishing approval. We've replaced a lot of our documents with OneNote. OneNote's part of Office. It runs using the Office clients or directly through the browser. It's a great way of accumulating and managing information without having to hide it away inside a document. Stop emailing people. Use Link, use Alerts, use Yammer, use anything except email. Email is definitely going out of fashion. Get rid of your file servers and your file shares. Move your stuff into your SharePoint libraries. But note the thing I said about large libraries. Get rid of your personal storage on hard drives or USB sticks and move your stuff into your personal sites in your intranet. So my site and other libraries and lists within OneDrive. Get your content offline. You can synchronize your SharePoint intranet and the libraries within that to both Outlook and to your local drive if you need to go and sit on a train or an aeroplane somewhere where you have no Wi-Fi. Use all these technologies to go paperless. Over the last year and a half, my company, Cloud2, has become completely paperless, and it's made an enormous difference to us as an organization. We're more agile, we're more secure, we're better governed. It's great. There's a whole range of things you can do to improve the templates and documents, so you're embedding the metadata directly in the documents and using smart documents and smart document templates. Make sure it's really easy to save documents directly into SharePoint. Intranet enable your meetings so people aren't turning up with their notepads and files. They're actually showing the content they want to share directly in the meeting workspaces within your intranet. Make sure you've thought about great ownership and every piece of content and every site in your intranet is owned. And do ensure you have a strategy and that you work to that. Some quick myths. People were worried that SharePoint's too expensive and that Office and cloud solutions are too expensive. You know, they're not. It's not that they're not costly, but they're mostly very, very cost effective. They're very flexible. Small businesses get as much value out of a cloud solution as big businesses. These solutions are definitely enterprise class. You know, again, Microsoft have really upped their game, as have the other providers, and they really are providing things that are not just for individuals, but they're for massive enterprises. And I think something like 85% of all the Fortune 500 companies in the world today are using Office 365, for instance. You definitely can do deep branding. I'm not going to show you that now for lack of time, but things like the Ferrari site and the Ferrari intranet are heavily branded Office 365 solutions. People go, well, Office 365, it's not Google or Apple or something else. No, it's not. They all have their strengths and weaknesses, but the Office 365 stack is pretty much the best business stack around there in the cloud today. People say these cloud solutions are unreliable. Our experience is they're very reliable, but that doesn't mean that things don't stop sometimes. The advantage is that when they recover really quickly and without you having to lift a finger. Most of them are very fast, but you do need to look at your internet speeds. Microsoft today is the only provider that is actively deploying all of their solutions to all of the operating systems. I think the only one on there that I would have a problem with is Windows XP. Windows XP is not actively supported, and certainly if you're using Internet Explorer 6 or 7, you've got a problem. But if you're using a modern device, I don't really care whether it's on Apple, Android, Linux, or one of the modern Windows operating systems. Some people think users don't like it. Users don't like complexity, but they do like things that work. And so the trick is to make sure that the solutions that you're building in the cloud do that. And making sure that they understand what it is they've got and they understand some of these best practices and the way that cloud solutions can make their life a bit easier. Well, if people say they don't need it, I point them back to one of our opening slides. If you want to be a mobile, agile organization, you probably do. The difficulty and the delay in doing anything that isn't in the cloud, of doing it on-premise, that's an issue. It is complex, however. All of this stuff is complex. Modern technology is. However, you can do simple things simply, and you can do the complex things complex in a complex way. The trick is to be granular and stratified in your approach. Some people are worried about it not working in their browser. I point you back to IE6 and IE7. It won't work, actually. But all the modern browsers, all the standards compliant browsers that you should be using, it will work with absolutely fine. I'm going to give you some takeaways and then I'm going to hand over. So, I'm not going to go through all of these. I'm just going to pick out a couple of things. I think a big issue is that these technologies are big and reasonably sophisticated. You can't do it all at once, and you need to understand that the flexibility comes with a price. You need to spend some time understanding all the things it can do, and don't try and do it all at once. Do make sure that your people have got awareness and appropriate depth of knowledge, which means training. Don't use the old ways. Don't try and do gatekeepers who manage everything. Use the security and permissions capabilities in these cloud tools to let your end users manage their own content. But then make sure you've got some checks and balances, some policies and governance to wrap around that. Encourage and actively encourage people to move to these new ways. People don't like change, but they will start to like it when it works for them. Don't write code. I'm not even going to say that again. Just don't write code. Yeah, I said it again. Use instead standard functionality wherever possible. Keep things as simple as you can. And then, just to finish off my piece, some reminders around risk. The stuff's complicated. Licensing is complicated. The concepts are complicated. Misinformation is rife. Spend some time understanding it. Support your business change. The technology is mature, but some of the commercial processes that are associated with these cloud solutions are not that mature. There are still some risks around Snowden, and the revelations of things like Snowden really make you have to think about what you're doing. I don't think that putting your stuff on site is any more secure than putting it in the cloud, but you need to be very aware of the risks and know how you're going to respond to them when people challenge you. You do need to look to the future. Not only will the technology change underneath your feet, but you need to think about what happens when your technology vendors change or new vendors enter the market or traditional vendors disappear. The big guys tend to be really stable, but plan for that. You also need to think about any changes in the law and our cultural environment. You need to address users' perception around performance. What is the user experience like? How do you address their perception that sometimes things are slower than doing it the old way? Even if the overall net experience is that they can do things faster, users will tend to focus on particular things, and we think that you need to have your answers ready before they start looking for a scapegoat. And that's it. I've finished my piece. With that, I'm going to hand over to my colleagues, and I'm ready to take some questions towards the end. Thank you for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you, Simon. What an interesting presentation. Now, Simon was talking about the importance of managing perceptions of performance within organizations that have moved to the cloud. I'd like to hand over to Mick from Application Performance to give us an overview of how performance can be managed in this environment, especially in the cloud.
Okay, thanks Zoe and thanks Simon. My name is Mick McGuinness. I'm the co-founder and technical director of Application Performance. We're a company that specializes in monitoring and accelerating the performance of applications. SharePoint is particularly one of interest to us, one that we have lots of customers who are using SharePoint and these days Office 365 as well, ranging from the very small companies right the way through to some of the largest global organisations. So we've been doing this for 10 years now, and we're very specialised in what we do. If anybody's seen us at any of our SharePoint events that we've done recently, like the SharePoint Saturday and some of the SharePoint Roadshow events, you may have seen this 6 steps to faster SharePoint that we talk about. So within that, we're talking about monitoring and acceleration. From a monitoring point of view, we talk about monitoring the end user experience, understanding what the end user is getting in terms of performance, understanding the network, and then understanding the back-end servers and application and how that's performing. From an acceleration point of view, we then look at how we can make things faster by speeding up page load times, speeding up document uploads and downloads. So there we partner with Riverbed. Their technology works equally well with SharePoint on-premise or Office 365. And then we also provide support services, so if you have a problem and you want to call in one of our experts to troubleshoot and do a performance review, we offer those kinds of services as well. But if you just think about monitoring for a second, looking at the performance of an application like SharePoint, if you simplify it down to the real basics, there's three main areas where things can go wrong. You've got the client side, where the performance can be dependent on the hardware and software that the end user is running on. That could be these days a mobile device, it could be a desktop or laptop machine, and really the key things there are the hardware and the software. Is it a modern device, in which case it's probably also likely to have a modern browser like IE 11 or possibly 10 running on a new operating system, in which case it's likely to be faster. At the other extreme, you could have somebody that's on a very slow device, maybe a mobile device, could even be a very low-end device that doesn't have much CPU or memory. And in that case, then obviously performance is likely to be worse. So that's one factor. The second thing then is the connection. You've got this network connection between your client and your server, and there's lots of things you could look at. The two key metrics I picked out here are latency and bandwidth of that connection. Latency being how long does it take packets to go from the client to the server and back again. And when you think about the cloud, that's going over the internet. That could be maybe 5 hops if you're close to the data center. That could be 25 hops or more if you're at the other side of the world. So there's a lot of places then where things can go wrong along that journey. And then finally, you've got the back-end servers. So in the past, where you had SharePoint on-premise, you would be monitoring those servers yourselves. These days, that's hosted by the cloud provider, so Microsoft in the case of Office 365. So you don't have any visibility into what's happening on the servers. You can't see if the CPUs are running hot. You can't see if it's running out of memory. But there are still things that you can see there, and there are still things you need to be aware of, like one of the examples Simon gave in his presentation about using content by search instead of content by query, because if you're doing things within web parts that are causing an overhead on the Microsoft servers, they can throttle you, or it could be just causing you slow performance. So it's still something to consider. What I wanted to focus on for this presentation in particular was just number one here, which is the end user monitoring, and take a look at two different ways you can look at the end user experience when you move to Office 365. So two ways of monitoring end user experience. You've got what's called real user monitoring, which is looking at the real users out there and looking at the page load times that those users are being delivered. So that's one way of monitoring, and that's very good for being able to see for every single page what did the page load time look like, and then you can segment that by location, by browser, by site, and so on, to try and figure out where the areas of slowness might be within your your SharePoint implementation. The other way of doing it is using synthetic monitoring, where you basically record a transaction and then have that played back. The advantage to that is there you're also testing availability, so you can see when things go down. But the other thing is that you're also limiting the variables, and you're basically replaying exactly the same sequence of pages from exactly the same browser on the same machine in the same location over and over again. So it's a better way of getting a baseline, so you can see if things start to change, then you know that you've got a problem. Whereas when you're looking at real users, things can often happen that are completely outside of your control. With a move to mobility, people could be working on the train, in which case they go through a tunnel, they lose their connectivity. That shows as a poor page load time when you're looking at your data, but it's something that's completely outside of your control. So I'm going to just explore those two different ways of doing monitoring, because Application Performance, we have solutions for both of these, and in fact we would recommend that you probably need both. So first of all, our WebTuna product is our real user monitoring solution. Basically what this is doing is measuring the real end user experience for every page, for every visitor to your site. It's not a synthetic transaction solution, it's actually looking at the real users. And I'll show you a demo of this in a couple of minutes. The way this works is you put a small piece of JavaScript into your master page. So this works in the cloud or on premise, it doesn't really matter. And what that will do is it will time every single page and then allow you to get this answers to these kinds of questions. So you can see, for example, is the site really slow? You may get anecdotal feedback from your end users saying SharePoint's slow, but what does that mean? Is it really slow? Is it just that user's perception of what slow means? Is it the entire site is running slow, or is it just particular users? So understanding who's affected. Is it just users in a particular location, for example? It may be the network connection to that location's got a problem. How does it vary by browser or device type? Maybe users on modern browsers are getting good performance, but those that are still running on older browsers are getting poor performance, in which case you can justify upgrading those users. Identifying which are the slowest pages on the site, because what may be the case is it's not everything that's running slow, it might just be certain pages. And quite often what we see is it's that home page for the intranet, is that very first page that people see when they open their browser. Quite often there's a temptation to put as much content as possible onto that home page, and then that page runs slow, and that's the page that is getting the most traffic. It's the one that users see the most often, and that quite often that will then skew their perception of SharePoint, and in that user's mind they think the whole SharePoint is slow, when it might actually just be that home page. So being able to understand that and know which pages on the site are slow and which ones aren't. And then to understand, is it a back-end server problem? So do I need to speak to Microsoft? Is it the server side that's got an issue, or is it the front end? And if it's the front end, then the front end part of the page load time is getting all the images and style sheets and JavaScript from the servers back to the client, in which case that could be down to the network, or it could be down to your content that you've created. You could have, we've seen cases recently, web pages that have got a 10 megabyte image on the page. So that's the kind of thing that can be spotted by doing real user monitoring. So it's going to point you where you need to invest your time. To get this in, it's really simple. You just basically add a couple of lines of JavaScript into your master page. One goes into the head of the page, and in fact that was just needed for older browsers. Modern browsers don't actually use that. And then the second line here is just a call to webtuna.js, which is about 4 kilobytes in size, so it doesn't really add any overhead to the actual page load itself. And you can put that as far down the page as you want. You can actually put that right at the bottom of the body. What then happens is users navigate SharePoint as they normally would. After the onload event that signifies that the page load has completed, there is then an asynchronous request that then sends that timing information back to your central WebTuna server. And that can either be hosted as software as a service, or it can be an on-premise WebTuna server. It's entirely up to you. And then that's where you can then log in to view that information. So what I'm going to do, I'll demo both of these products at the end. I'll show you WebTuna and I'll show you this other one, Exaprise. But I just wanted to give you a high-level overview of both of them first of all. So Exaprise is a synthetic monitoring solution. So it's a software agent that installs on any Windows machine. That could be an existing Windows machine that you already have in your organization. You could put this in, one of these software agents in each of your branch offices around the world. And what that's doing is actively testing your cloud services. So there are sensors available for SharePoint and SharePoint Online and Exchange Online and Link. And then various other cloud services as well, some of the Google services, Salesforce.com, ServiceNow, and so on. So this will actively test those services and tell you when there's an issue, and then when there is an issue, it will alert you to that and then do some diagnostics as to where along the path things have started to break. So here's an example of some of the sensors that are currently available. So lots of the Microsoft Cloud technologies are supported, as well as some other cloud providers. Very quick to get up and running with this. One of the really nice things about this solution is this comparative analysis, where basically what they can do is compare the experience that you're getting with the experience of the crowd. So that would be everybody else that happens to be running the same sensor as you. So for example, if you're monitoring SharePoint Online and you've got a sensor running from, let's say, London, you could then compare yourself against all the other customers that also happen to be running a SharePoint Online sensor that are located within the same geography, and see whether you're doing better or worse than everybody else. And if there's a spike in performance, you can see, did everybody else suffer that same spike? Or if there's an outage, you can see, is everybody else having this outage at the same time? So that's one of the really cool features of Exaprise. So I'm going to just jump into a demo now and just quickly show you both of these solutions. So first of all, WebTuna, as I mentioned, you just need to make those couple of lines of JavaScript change to your site. So what I've got here is I've got one line here towards the bottom of my master page that loads the WebTuna JavaScript. I've also put in a couple of lines here actually to capture the username. So this is an optional thing. It depends on your privacy rules and regulations whether you want to do that or not. But if you wanted to, you can capture the username as well. So I have that turned on for this Office 365 site. So this is the site. It's basically just a test environment running out there in Office 365, and I can navigate around here. And as I navigate around, each of these clicks is being tracked by WebTuna. So I go into the user interface. This is basically what it looks like. The first screen you see is the Geo dashboard. So you can see for all the active users now. So I'm looking at 3 different Office 365 sites here. My test site has just got 2 users on there. And you can see where the users are coming from around the world, and then also you can see the performance that the users are experiencing. So the color here, red, amber, green, is related to performance. So there's lots of red out here in Asia Pacific and Australia. And then the size of the bubble indicates the number of requests coming from that location. So UK and US have the biggest user populations in this case. So if you used to click into some of these, you can have a look. China, average response time 9 seconds, Korea 48 seconds, although that was only based on 3 page views. India, 5.8 seconds, and then if you compare that to some of the better ones, so UK 2.9 and US 2.9 as well here. And what you can do is you could click down into the country to get a kind of from the country level view to see like the individual offices within that country, and then for one of the ones that's having a problem, let's have a look at Chicago, or let's have a look, who's a good one to pick on, somebody down in Trying to find somebody who's done a bit more activity. So here's one out in Maryland. They've got an average of 8.7 seconds. They've done 7 page views. And if we click down into that one, it's typical. My session had timed out because I had this set up. Sorry, I just need to go back into that again. Let's probably pick on a different one this time. So here we go, so somebody down in Houston this time. And we can click into there. And we can see now the IP address of this particular user down in Houston. They were running Internet Explorer 9 but in compatibility mode. They were on a Windows 7 desktop machine. This is the internet service provider that they were using. And then as we go down here, we can see we've got the timing for every single page that they visited. You can see what the page load time was there. And that's broken down into the green and the blue. The green is the time to get the first byte of the response back. So if that's a long period of time, then that would generally indicate that you've got a server-side response time issue. Whereas if the blue bar is the longest component, like you see here, then that is just that's the time getting the page contents back over the network back to the client. So in that case, you would probably want to look at the page contents to see whether there were any particularly large resources within the page, or it may just be down to network connectivity. So that's the real user monitoring side of things. I just wanted to give you a quick flavour for the synthetic monitoring as well with Exaprise. This is their dashboard. They're running a number of different probes here. Some of them are SharePoint, some of them are ADFS, various other things as well. There's an Amazon one there too. If I show you this one here, Cambridge App Office 365, this is my one. It's actually testing that Office 365 site that I just showed you there. And it's testing it from my machine here in Cambridge. So if I click into that one, this is probably timed out as well, probably asked me to log back in. No. Here we go. So what this test is doing in this case is it's doing an authentication to log into Office 365 and getting to the home page. It's then doing an upload of a 400K document and then a download of that 400K document. So that's basically what this test is doing. The metrics I'm looking at here is the logon time. So I'm comparing myself, which is the dark green there, to the crowd, which is everybody else in the world. So in general, I'm better than the crowd here. So I'm getting faster. Yeah, my logon time is faster than everybody else. But there were 2 spikes here. Where my logon time spiked. And I can click into one of these data points then and see the data point details down the bottom. So at that point in time, it took me 29 seconds to log on, whereas the average for everybody else at that point in time was 10 seconds. So there's obviously an issue there at that point in time. I can click on a different one there. So again, I was much higher than the crowd. Same thing for upload as well. And some of the other measurements you can see here, we're collecting the SharePoint health score. So the crowd, that was 0, which means that there was no issues with the SharePoint farm at that point in time. For me, when I had that spike, the SharePoint health score was 4. So that indicates that there was something going on there at that point in time where the SharePoint farm that I'm connected to wasn't entirely healthy at that time. You can also see the SharePoint request duration. So this is how many milliseconds that request took to be processed within SharePoint. So for the crowd, the average was 569 milliseconds, but for me it was 4.6 seconds at that period of time. So that's probably related to the fact that SharePoint wasn't so healthy there. We're not able to tell what that is because obviously that's Microsoft. That's inside the Microsoft data center. But if this was a persistent problem rather than just a one-off spike, that's the kind of thing that you could talk to Microsoft support about and say, I'm consistently getting slow response time, and I can see that the SharePoint health score is non-zero at that point. The other thing that you've got alongside this is network path performance. Just wanted to finish on this. So as well as actively testing the actual login and the document upload and download, we're also doing network testing with this as well. So you can see that the total round-trip time from my software agent here in Cambridge to the Microsoft Office 365 data center is 239 milliseconds, and most of that is spent in the BT internet. So 200 milliseconds is BT internet, 33 milliseconds is within the Microsoft network, and you can see a hop-by-hop comparison down here. So actually, to get all the way from my machine here in Cambridge to this Office 365 site in the Microsoft Data Center was 13 hops there. And if there were any particular issues along the way, that would then obviously get highlighted as well. And if it was in your network, then obviously you can fix it. If it's in the Microsoft network, you speak to them, or if it's in the middle, if it's on the public internet, there may be nothing you can do. But if it's your internet service provider, again, it's something that you can call them up and say, I can see that you know, one of your routers I'm getting a particularly slow response time from, and please could you fix it for me. So that's all I've got time for. I think we're at the end of the hour now, so I'm just going to hand it back over to Zoe and just see if any questions have come in.
So thank you to you both for such a useful overview of SharePoint as a cloud. Whilst the presentations were in progress, a number of you did ask questions, and as we're short of time, I'd just like to ask a couple. How would you go about migration from conventional systems into the cloud?
Right, it's relatively complex. Yes, inevitably for me. Yeah, it's relatively complex. It depends whether you're planning to migrate content, in which case there's some fairly straightforward ways of doing that. I think I alluded to the tools that AvePoint and MetaLogix have earlier, and they also have some content migration tools. If you're wanting to migrate entire existing SharePoint solutions, again, there are tools for doing that. Often, though, we see that the existing solutions are not fit for purpose anymore, and they actually need rebuilding. But if you do have a perfectly good solution and want to migrate that, again, both AvePoint and MetaLogix have got migration tools. If not, then you have to do a manual build in the cloud and migrate your content over by one of a number of different routes. I think when you move into some of the broader technologies, you know, migrating email, then it gets a bit more complex, and I probably can't describe that. But today, you know, we either build new and move the content, or we use a tool to do migration of everything.
Okay, and just one other question. What happens if the platform goes down?
Yeah, well, I guess, I mean, in a perfect world, it'd be easy to say, well, the platform never goes down. I mean, it's unlikely, not impossible, but unlikely for the platforms themselves to go down, certainly with the big providers. You know, they've got massive redundancy in this. I think I spoke to one of the Microsoft guys back at a big conference earlier in the year, and they were saying that any given piece of data is actually stored on 11 different platters across their system, so 11 different hard drives, if you like, and several of those are in different countries. So the thing is massively resilient, massively tolerant, with enormous backup. Having said that, things can and do fail. And what we tend to see is not that the entire platform stops, but that individual services will have a partial error. And the worst ones we've seen so far have been some errors where you can't log in. Platform runs fine, people who are already logged in are fine, but the login service has stopped, and that can be a problem. There's a couple of consequences to that. First of all is, you know, you've got a bit of a problem. I don't think it's any worse than when your own local platform goes down. The good news is that Microsoft or Amazon or whoever will bring that platform back up as quickly as possible, and they have massive expertise in that. I've never seen something down for more than an hour or two, so it's not horrible. And if you do go down, they'll pay you. So they all tend to have money-backed SLAs now. So they don't just go, we're working on it. They go, we're working on it, and we'll pay you back a proportion of your tenancy for the time that we're out.
Okay. Well, Simon, that's been very helpful, and thank you to Mick for your demonstrations, which were very informative, I thought, on the differences between synthetic and real user monitoring. All good points there. So thanks to everyone for listening and contributing such interesting questions. This webinar has been recorded, and we'll send you a link to the recording in the next few days. And someone has also asked about whether they can get a copy of the presentation, and yes, we'll be delighted to send that to you. So thanks for attending, and we look forward to speaking with you again soon. Have a good evening.